Hello and welcome to Beyond the Basics of Arcpy.mp or Python Map Automation. My name is Jeff Barrett and my partner in crime over there on the drums is Jeff Molds, and both of us are product engineers on the Arcpy.mp team. So we're responsible for collecting requirements, designing the API, testing, and documentation. Today we're excited to talk to you about Python Sim Access, which is a relatively new capability that was introduced in ArcGIS Pro 2.4 and fully documented at Pro 2.5. The SIM, or Cartographic Information Model, sounds fancy, but it's really just a specification for how we persist everything that you do in a project to disk, so that when you open a project, you can recreate consistently all of that information. Python Sim Access has several entry points, and they are analogous to the types of objects that you can save out as X files. So you can connect to a map, which has a corresponding map X, or a layout, a page X, or layers that have layer X files. Now these files are in a JSON format that is really easy to read, and the information is organized in a way that it's almost like an object model diagram. So in the example we see here, we have an attribute table or feature table, and that feature table at its root level has some properties associated with it, like display field. It also has field descriptions or a list of fields, and those at that root level have attributes as well, like field name and alias. Now, object ID happens to be a numerically defined field, so it has additional attributes that are available to it. And all of these are organized in a nice kind of tabbed format as you go from the parent down into the individual sub properties. Now, what's nice is once you connect to one of these objects through the SIM, and we'll talk about that very briefly, the way that you code using IntelliSense is identical to how you read the structure in its tabbed format in the JSON. So once we have a SIM layer, we can get to its feature table, then to its field descriptions. We're going to grab the first field, and we're going to set its visibility to be false or to turn it off. Now, why do we provide SIM access? Because you need finer-grained capabilities to project properties. Pro is growing so rapidly, and there are so many teams that are part of ArcGIS Pro. There are about 50 of them. They're constantly introducing new capabilities. And with SIM access, you'll have immediate access to those capabilities with each release. The Arcpy.mp team is pretty small, and there's no way that we can keep up with all of the team's new capabilities and expand our API to encapsulate all that. So we've provided an architecture or a way for you to get to those additional properties outside of our managed or curated API. Now, this has been available to the .NET community almost from the very beginning, and it makes complete sense that we make this available to the Python community as well. Now, equally as important is, there's good reasons for using the SIM, but, it's not a magic bullet. It's not going to do everything that can be persisted to file out on disk. You won't have access to all of that. For example, many of the backstage project options aren't available through the SIM API. Metadata is not available because a lot of that information is persisted as a binary reference. Now, there is a metadata API that allows you to edit and read and modify metadata, but you can't get to it through the SIM. And then there are some things that you think you may be able to change, but you really can't. And a great example of that is spatial reference. Spatial reference is persisted throughout the project. You have layers, you have maps, you have default extents, you have all these locations where spatial reference is defined. So if you think you can just change it in one location that you found it in the SIM, well, you may not realize that there are many other locations that also need to have that same value changed. So there are good reasons for having a managed API or helper functions that do a lot of tasks for you without you having to figure out all those steps. Now, this is an outdated bullet, but I like to keep it in there because we've always said, even with ArcMap, Arcpy.mapping, you cannot create new objects. You must author everything ahead of time and then use Python to automate the changes to those objects. And the same is true with the sim. If we just gave you sim access, you can only modify what's persisted in those JSON structures. But if there's some new capability that you want persisted to file when you save a project, well, you would need to be able to create objects. And so we'll get into this in the second half of my presentation. But at 2.5, we've released the ability to actually create sim objects, and we'll explain that. One of the most important things is with sim development, there really isn't a lifeguard on duty. With the UI or managed APIs, we protect you from making mistakes or from putting the application into a bad state. So for example, if you're in the user interface and you select an option, and when you select that option, it disables other options, right? Because you can't have both. It's either or, right? Well, with the sim, we give you access to all of that stuff. So you could actually set all of those things at the same time, perhaps, for the application into a bad state. So it's possible that you can do things to your project that you really shouldn't. So it's always important that you have backups of your project, especially when you're doing sim development, because you don't want to introduce anything that you can undo, and you really need to test thoroughly. All right, so the basic workflow for working with the sim is you have 4 entry points or 4 types of objects. We can either get the sim definition for a map, a layer, a table, or a layout. So we'll use the standard Arcpy.mp API to reference one of those objects. And then for sim access, we provided 2 additional functions, get definition and set definition. So on that object, you can get its sim definition, and it returns the sim object reference with all those additional properties that you now have access to. Get definition has a required parameter called version, and at release 2.2x, you don't even have to worry about it. You're always going to use version 2. But the reason that version is there is that ArcGIS Pro honors semantic versioning, which means that at a next major release, for example 3.0, we can make breaking changes for future enhancements. Those breaking changes can happen to our SDKs, they can happen to the sims. So that means potentially if you wrote something that does sim work at 2.x, it may not work correctly at 3.x. But because you have the ability to specify the version of the sim that you're working with, then you can then write scripts in 2.x and then run them in 3.x because it'll use the appropriate version of the sim. So anyway, there's some detail there, but it's really important concept, and it's something we had to consider for future changes. But once you have a reference to a sim definition, then just modify those sim properties however you wish. And then once you're done making those changes, you push those sim changes back to the object using set definition. Now I'm going to show you a couple of demonstrations here. Before I do, I just want to emphasize down at the bottom here, we have sim samples and we have a shortened URL, and Jeff's going to be giving you some of those as well. https://esriurl.com, and then to get to all of the data and the scripts that I'm going to be showing, the number is 8899. And I'm going to switch over to my browser so I can show you what that page looks like. So we have a location in ArcGIS Online where we provide a lot of samples for people to download and start playing with Arcpy.mp and Arcpy mapping as well. But the one that I want to bring your attention to is Python Sim Access. So if you go to 8899, it brings you to this page, and then from this page you can drill down into and download the sample that we make available. There are 30 different samples or scripts that modify the sim in a variety of different ways, whether it be against layouts, layers, maps, tables, etc. Now I'm going to switch over to ArcGIS Pro, and this is the actual project that you would download from that location. We have a number of maps and layouts that you can work with that the scripts work against. So we have scripts for updating data sources, scripts for manipulating maps, layouts, layers and tables, as well as layer symbology. The first sample I want to show you is the one that you've kind of already seen in screenshots, where we set field visibility. So I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to turn off a couple of these layers just for a future step. And I'm going to open up the attribute table for Great Lakes. Let me undock it. Oh, I'll try that again. And you can see that it has an object ID, a shape, and it has shape length and shape area. I want to format this stuff. I want to change the aliases and the formatting of the numerics. And I also want to hide object ID and shape, just so that they don't appear inside of the table. Now, if I go to this and I edit this scripts tool, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the first 4 lines of code here. The first 3 lines are from Arcpy.mp, and you're already familiar with those. The 4th line is when I'm referencing the layer object and I'm returning its sim definition. So let me copy that, and I'm going to paste that into the Python window. And I'm going to hit enter. So as we're all familiar with, if I type L dot, this is the Arcpy.mp layer class, and these are all of the members that are associated with it. Now I have that L class and I've returned its sim representation. So if I type L underscore sim dot, now we'll see all those additional members that are being exposed through JSON. So we see things like charts, and if we come down here, we're going to see something called, let's see, feature table. And we'll be looking at this one next. So if I type feature table and then dot, well, then I get additional properties off of a feature table. So let's actually look at the code. So where do all of those properties actually come from? That's what I want to look at next. And to do that, a really nice methodology is to take the object that you want to manipulate using sim access and evaluate one of those JSON files. So here I have a layer, and I'm going to save it as a layer file. It's going to call greatlakes.lyrx. And then I'll come over to that location, and then there it is. So I can either make a copy of this and then rename the copy, or because I'm not going to use this again, I'm just simply going to rename LYRX, which is associated with ArcGIS Pro, and I'm going to call it JSON, which is associated for me with Notepad++. When I open this file, we'll see that it's a sim layer document. It was created in version 2.7. And then there's all this layer definition information, right? So we have charts. Well, we saw charts in that IntelliSense. We have feature table. And as you saw in the screenshot, we have field descriptions and alias and field name and number format, etc. We'll look at this a little bit more. But I just want you to understand there's so many more properties that are available to you that are specific to this particular layer that can be modified through the sim, where those same properties aren't exposed through the managed API. And we close this, and I'll minimize this. So let's go back to the code, and let's look at what it does. So we have the layer, and we returned its sim definition. Now what we're going to do is for every field in that feature table, and for each of those field descriptions, we're going to check the sim property field name to see if it's either object ID or if it's shape. If it is, we're going to set those visibility to be false so they do not appear in the table. Then next, we're going to look for field name shape area and shape length. We're going to change their aliases appropriately. We're going to round the number of decimals to 2. We'll pad with zeros, and we'll use comma separators. And finally, when we've done everything we wanted to do, we're going to take that modified sim definition and push it back to the main object, in this case, a layer. So to run this, I'm just simply going to double click. I'll click run. And now you can see our table is updated. We have object ID and shape are no longer visible, and we've modified our aliases and all the numeric formatting for our fields. And because this information is also used in a table frame in a layout, all that was modified as well there. So if I come back to all of our samples, let me just show you a couple other things. Let me turn these back on. I'm going to zoom in a little bit to this layout. I'm just going to make some modifications to this legend and to this text, just to show you that we have other samples. So if I come down to the layout section, I can execute this, which updates legend items, the visibility, so only show me the patches that are in the visible extent. It also changes the patch shape. So I'll run this. And you can see that the layout has updated. And then the next script is just going to modify some of the spacing and some of the legend properties. So I'll just modify the legend title and some of that spacing. And so you can see all of that's updated. And then lastly, just very quickly, one more sample. I'm going to modify paragraph text. So I'm going to take this text paragraph right here, and I'm going to make modifications to it using properties that aren't exposed in the managed API. And so here you can see I went in and I changed the individual text colors. I changed the or the justification of it, as well as I added, I made it 2 columns instead of just 1. So this is just very quick example. Again, there's 30 of these things that show you how to work with the sim in a variety of different ways using that basic pattern that I showed you during this demonstration. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. And the next topic I want to talk about is creating sim objects. This is new at ArcGIS Pro 2.5. Now this is really important to understand. And the easiest way to figure out whether or not you need to create objects is to start with a JSON file. That's your starting point. Make the change that you want to have happen in the application, save that out as another JSON file, and then use something like file merge or whatever to look for differences. Now in this particular case, in this example, I want to be able to set the background color of a map. But if a map doesn't have a background color, that object that persists the properties for background color won't exist in the sim, because the sim only persists what's needed to recreate whatever you've authored. So now I can see in this resulting JSON that we have a property called background color in the sim definition, and it is a sim RGB color. So all sim objects start with CIM, and they come after this property called type. Once I create a sim RGB color, then I will have access to be able to modify its string of values. So to create an object, we call the Arcpy sim module, and in that module we call the function called create sim object from class name. We pass in the name of the sim class that we see in the JSON, and then again we specify the version. Then now we have access to those RGB color values. We're setting them to be a kind of a dark gray. And then we set the background color to that object we've just created. All right, let's take a look at this. It's really simple. I'm going to go back to ArcGIS Pro. And let's look at, under Maps, create or set background color. And I'm going to edit this. And again, I'm going to go back to my Python window, which I closed. And I'm going to copy and paste these 3 lines. Okay, so now that we have the sim representation of a map, right? We have our map object, which we're all familiar with, but now we have our sim representation of it. And we do have a property called background color. But if I get the type of that returned value, we'll see that it's empty. Because if I go into the properties of my map and I look at the background color, there isn't a color. Therefore, nothing's persisted in the sim. Therefore, I can't change the background color unless I create it. So that's what this script does. It gets the map sim representation. It then checks to see if background color is null or not. If there isn't a background color, like it is initially, we're going to call ArcPySim create sim object from class name. We pass in the object, we set the color values, we set that back to the background property, and then again, we will set the definition. Now what this does though is if you run it multiple times, you'll see different results, because if it's none, it executes this. But if it does have a color, then we're simply going to change it to a different color. And again, we set it back to the map. So let's run this. Close this. I'll turn these off so we can just see the background. I'll run it. Now the first time I run it, I expect to see 130, 130, 130, and then 100 opacity. And then if I run it again, I'm going to get a different color because it had a color and so it changed it. Here's another example here. It's under layouts and creating a map series. I'm going to look at this script. And this one's really simple too. So again, how do I know what type of object to create? Well, I had a layout that didn't have a map series. I saved it to JSON, a PageX file. And then I authored a map series with all the property settings I wanted, and I saved that to a PageX JSON file. And then I compared the two. And I'll quickly realize that there's a sim object called sim spatial map series. So I simply create it using create sim object from class name. Then I go in and I specify all of those properties. I set that object to the map series property of the layout sim. And I take that definition and I set it back to the layout. So if I run this, let me just, I'll run this. And we'll see now that my extent has changed because I've enabled and authored map series using Arcpy.mp through Python Sim Access. This is something we could never do in ArcMap, something we couldn't do in the managed API of ArcGIS Pro, but you can do it through the sim. It's not to say we won't eventually be able to do it through the managed API, but right now, the only way you can do it is through the sim. If I come over here, you can see that we have all of our pages. So that's really exciting. All right, let me go back to my slides. And there's just one other thing I want to touch upon. That I may have made it look really easy to create objects and make modifications to those objects using the sim. And that's because I used very simple examples, right? I just had to create one object, modify its properties. That's true of the background color for a map, and it was true of creating a spatial map series. But there are cases where when you create a new object, it has properties that need to be set to other objects. And so therefore you need to create those other objects as well. And here's the example. I want to create a brand new line graphic element on my layout. And if I were to author a line element to my layout, and that's a real trick, you create a blank layout, you add a single line element, save that out to a PageX, and look at the JSON. I would see that I need to create a sim graphic element. But that sim graphic element may have some simple text properties that needs to be set, like name and anchor location, etc. But it also needs to have a graphic associated with it, an actual geometry. So in order for me to do that, in order for me to set that property, I need to create that line graphic. But that line graphic is associated to and is referencing symbology. So I need to create a symbol reference. And that symbol reference needs a line symbol. And that particular type of line symbol, I'm using a solid stroke. So you can see that even though all I wanted to do was create one object on a layout, I had to create 1, 2, 3, 4 additional objects. And I read the JSON structure in such a way that I start with the innermost class first, and I work my way all the way out to the parent, kind of like reverse engineering. So we have samples that help you understand it. I highly encourage you to download those samples and start playing. I hope you have a good time. I'm going to pass the torch to Jeff. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Jeff Molds, and I'm a product engineer based out of Redlands, California, and I work on the layout and Arcpy.mp teams. I'm going to start off by talking about using the sim to access time and range map properties. Now, as Jeff Barrett stated previously, one of the challenges when building the Arcpy.mp module is that as new features get added to ArcGIS Pro, Arcpy.mp may not be able to mirror the new functionality right away in the same release. One example is the ability to make a time map series. In previous conferences, I would often show how to use the sim to make a time-based map book, meaning for each time slice of a time-enabled layer, I would create the map series page and then stitch all the time slice PDFs together into a complete map book. However, in ArcGIS Pro version 2.8, which is coming around May 2021, we're planning on including map time and layer time classes to the Arcpy.mp module. So that means you don't necessarily need the sim to do any time stuff in the next release. However, if you still want to know how to use the sim for time, I included a link on the slide to last year's presentation. And here's a sneak peek of the map and layer time classes that we're planning on including in 2.8. One caveat is that we can't 100% guarantee that all this new stuff will be there in the next release due to any unforeseen circumstances. However, that is the plan as of now. So instead, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you how to create a range map series. And that would be similar to a time map series in that each page in my map book will show a specific range value. And then I'll stitch all the time slice PDFs together into a map book. So let's open up ArcGIS Pro, and I'll start off by just showing you what ranges are. So here's the project that I'm going to use in my demo. And what I have here is a range-enabled floor plan for a multi-story building. And I will activate this map frame. And I'm going to show you the range slider here. So this range slider is tied to an attribute in the buildings layer that represents the floor. So I could just move the range slider to show different floors. And there's also the range ribbon, and this has all sorts of properties about the range slider, for example, the min and max floors. And what I'm going to use is the Arcpy sim module to get and set all these range properties. And that will allow Arcpy to simulate moving the range slider and allow us to make a range map book for each separate floor of this building. So what I'm going to do first is I have a script tool here that builds my range map series. And I'm going to just start off by running the script. And it's a pretty simple script. It doesn't have any parameters at this point. And this is going to do 3D export, which takes about a minute. So I'm going to run this. And then while it's running, I'm going to show you the code. Okay, so that's running right now. And let me switch over to show you the code. So first thing the code is doing is just making a master PDF file. And this is the PDF that all the individual floor PDFs are going to get appended to. Then I reference the project layout that I'm going to use, and also a text element that I'll use later on in my script. And right here, I get the layout sim, and that's the get definition function here that gets the sim for the layout. And then I'm going to loop through all the elements in my layout and find the map frame. And then I loop through all the floors, and that's right here. This bit of code right here is interesting because this is where I first referenced the sim, and this gets the max slider extent, which is the top floor of my building, so that I'll never go past that floor. And then, so now I'm on iteration 1 of my loop. So this is the first floor. So I set the min and max values to 1 to represent the first floor. Now, this brings up the question, how do I know which sim properties to read? Now, as Jeff stated before, you could export the layout as a PageX file. And the PageX file is also the sim JSON structure of the layout. Then you could open up that file in Notepad++. So I'll show you that here. So I created a PageX file of my layout. Then I gave it a JSON extension. Now I have this opened up in Notepad++. And this is basically like your object model diagram of the properties that you could modify with the sim module. And our help topics tell you how to navigate this, and navigating the sim may take a while to get used to because there's a lot of stuff in here. And I know that this is the layout definition. And then here's all the elements that are on the layout. And the first element, 0, is my map frame. And the range slider settings are in here in layer ranges. And this is where I'm setting the min and max for the floor numbers. I also will show you the max value here. That's what I used at the top of my loop. So that's the max number of floors right here. Okay, so this is what I'm going to modify in my script. So I'll go back to ArcGIS Pro, and the script has finished running. And I could look at the output PDF. And here we go. So this is the output. So each floor has a page. So I could cycle through all 5 pages. Okay, and so that concludes the range map series portion of the presentation. I'll go back to my slides. Now, let's shift gears a bit and look at some cases where the SIM module can help us in updating data source workflows. Now, just some background before we dive into the SIM. First off, what do I mean when I use the term updating data sources? Well, it refers to any scenario where you need to change your layer's data source. So the picture on this slide represents a scenario where we're moving from a test enterprise geodatabase to a production geodatabase. So in this workflow, all the layers that are currently pointing to feature classes in the test geodatabase need to be resourced to the production database. This would be a good workflow to automate with a script, because if you had many, perhaps you have many layers inside of many projects that need to be updated. In the Arcpy.mp API, we have methods for updating data sources. And there's a link to the help topic on this slide that has many examples. Also on this slide, I've included a link to the user interface help topic as well. And I think it was in ArcGIS Pro version 2.6 that included a new dialog for managing all the data sources within a project. And that allows you to do bulk data source updating on a project, similar to what you would do in Arcpy. Now this slide also has a basic example of resourcing layers in a project from a test enterprise geodatabase to a production enterprise geodatabase. And that's this code sample at the bottom here. So on the project, we're going to call the update connection properties function. And this function is like a find and replace operation. So I'm going to find layers that reference this test enterprise geodatabase and resource the layers to this production enterprise geodatabase. So this simple script on the slide here actually required a more complicated SIM workflow prior to version 2.6. So it was at version 2.6 that we supported using an enterprise geodatabase connection file in the first parameter. So once we supported that workflow, a lot of the SIM data source workflows were kind of made superfluous. But modifying the SIM is still useful for some more advanced workflows. And one such workflow is changing the feature data set that a feature class resides in. For example, in the picture on this slide, let's say that your existing data is structured like this, where you have a parcels feature class residing at the root of a geodatabase. And let's say you get an updated geodatabase that has a new name and the data resides in a feature data set like this. And your task is to update a whole bunch of projects to point to the new data. And this is where Arcpy and the SIM module comes in. So let's look at the SIM for these two layers. One layer at the root and one layer in a feature data set. So at the top here, we have the SIM data structure for the existing layer that is at the root of the geodatabase. And I have the geodatabase and the feature class highlighted in green in the SIM. So those are the important parts of the SIM that we're interested in. Below is the SIM structure of the new layer. You can see that the new geodatabase and feature class are highlighted as well. But what's most important to note is number 1, which is a SIM node for the feature data set. So this requires creating a SIM object. And here is a script that will do that. So let's just walk through this code here. So the first thing is that I'm just specifying the new geodatabase properties. So that's the new geodatabase and the new updated parcels feature class. Then I reference a project, map, and layer. Then I get the layer's SIM definition. And now I'm actually creating a SIM object, and I'm creating a SIM standard data connection. Now, once I have this new database connection SIM object, I could specify the path to the new geodatabase. I also have to specify that it's a file geodatabase. And I also have to specify the dataset name. Then I set the layer's SIM data connection to my new data connection, and then I commit the SIM change. Now, ironically, you don't even need to explicitly set the new feature data set. So there is verification code that runs when you set the SIM definition that allows you to not have to worry about the feature data set. Okay, so that's working with feature data sets. One other last sample here is using the SIM to change the URL of a service layer. And here's a sample for that. So first I reference the project, map, and the layer. Then I get the layer's SIM. Then I update the layer's service connection URL. So this is my new URL to a different map service. Alternatively, you could also change the name, metadata, and things like that through the SIM as well. Here I just changed the name of the layer, and then I commit those changes. Okay, so that is the end of the presentation. Just remind you to provide your feedback for this session by clicking on the survey link below the video. And we will now open it up for Q&A.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending our session. Both Jeff and I have been answering your questions. Some of them we'll answer now during the live Q&A. Some of them we've replied to privately. But we really appreciate you taking the time to listen to our presentation today. I can tell you it's certainly a different approach. I prefer to be in front of you live. It's certainly odd to listen to myself present. But anyway, let me get to some of your questions, and there have been some really good ones. And I first want to start off with one that was made the statement that from Anonymous, they were confused about the difference between our managed API and SIM. And it's a really good question. So think of the managed API as what you've known up until now, right? And that's what Jeff and myself and our developer has been exposing to you. And with each release, we deliver a little more capability. But there are a lot of things that you want that aren't in that managed API. So one of our main developers came up with the idea of exposing the SIM to you like it is exposed to those that use the SDK, the .NET SDK. So don't think that you have to use the SIM, but consider the SIM if there's a property that you want to get to that we did not expose in our public API. So think of it as a fallback only. Don't think of it as the way to start things, but as a fallback in case something's missing. All right, so, and I'll use this to answer, this concept to answer other questions that have been brought up. So someone had asked, well, can we use the SIM to zoom to a layer? Well, my immediate response to that is, well, why would you do that when you can zoom to a layer using our managed API, right? Those properties exist on the map view. They exist on the map frame objects. So why use the SIM? But still, I think it's a really good question, because when you zoom to a layer, that's doing some things, right? It's looking at the contents of a layer. It's getting its extent, and then it's going to a map frame or a map view, and it's getting its information, and it's updating it with that layer's extent, and then it's changing the extent. Technically, I think I could do that with the SIM, but it would be a lot of work. So why not? Because all of those properties, camera settings, are persisted in one of those X files. But again, I just simply wouldn't jump to using the SIM. I would use the managed API first. So it's just one of those things that you have to try the managed API, and then you have to then try it in the SIM, and it may work. And that's a really, really important point here. With a lot of the questions that you ask us, Jeff and I don't know right offhand if you can do it in the SIM. We don't have every property, every capability that's available in the Pro application in our minds, right? So we will always try it and then determine whether or not it can be done. But the technique that we tried to share with you is to give you the tools and the procedures to try and figure that out on your own. So author it first, save it out to, author what you want, your results, save that out to, an LYRX or PageX file, etc. And then look at the changes between the before and the after to see what additional SIM properties have been added. And then if you can get to them through the SIM, because anything that you see in those files, you can get to through the techniques that we've shown you. But there are some things that are just going to be really hard. Properties are simple, and that's what's really great about using the SIM. It's slam dunk. You have some object, you've authored some object, it has a bunch of properties. They're not all exposed through the API, the managed API, but you can change them through the SIM. But someone asked a really good question. I think it was Mike, about table panes and being able to control the order of fields the way that you see them in a table view. And that's something that I think I could do using the SIM, but I'm going to admit that it's not easy. Think of the table view as a list of fields. And when you look at that actually in the SIM, you will see a table view object and then inside of it, you will see that there is a list of fields, and they're all in some specific order. And I believe that order is based on an ID. So I would imagine that you could take that list of field objects, manipulate it very carefully, put all of those objects back into a field list, and then push that field list back to the table view, and then push that back to the layer. And it might just work. I can't answer, I've not tried that, but that is the approach that I would take. Dealing with lists and list of things is going to make it a little more complicated versus just changing a property value. There was another similar question. Can you freeze a field using the sim? Now, that's an easier question to answer. I'm not going to tell you with 100% confidence if you can do it, but I'm pretty sure you can, because I think as a property of a field in the sim is, I think it's called is locked or something, right? So is it locked in its current position? And that's what you're going to have to look for. So again, you're going to take your layer, you're going to save it out to an LY or X, and you're going to look at the list of those fields in the table view, and you're going to look at the properties that are associated with it. If there's one that's called is locked, then I'm pretty certain that's the approach that you're going to take. Let me, those are all the questions that I've had memorized in my head, and now I'm gonna just kind of take a couple seconds here and look at some of the other questions. Someone asked a really good question about whether or not all of this different sim classes, all of the possible sim objects that you can create using create sim object from class, are they documented somewhere? And the answer is unfortunately not. That list is constantly growing. It's a very, very, very long list. And again, the technique that we've advocated is that you evaluate the X files and you look at the thing that you want to modify, and you can simply see what that sim string is. So someone's asking, Steve is asking the question, oh, it was already been replied to. Does changing the layer source in the sim still require Pro documents to be saved? Well, if you want to change the source of a layer and you want it to be persistent after you make that change for some date in the future, then yes. But if you just want to change the source for some sort of script that's running in process and it generates its results and maybe spits out a value or a PDF or whatever, and if that source defaults back to its original source, that's completely up to you, right? That's all part of your automation design. Let's see, I'm just kind of scrolling through the.
There's another one in there for related to updating the URL in a map. And the question is, what about if it's a service where you need to log in? This I have not tried. I don't know what the sim structure looks like for a service that is requires a username and password. My guess is that if you have a connection to that portal and you run the script as a script tool, it'll just work. Or there's also Arcpy has a sign into portal and sign out to portal that you could wrap the sim update in. And I think that would work, but I haven't tried it.
Thanks, Jeff. Another good question, can you delete sim properties? And the example that they're using is remove the color of a background. I'm pretty certain I tried this actually, because in one of the samples that we make available to you through our ArcGIS online site or webpage is changing the color of a map. you can actually set the color property to be none, right? And you didn't really delete the properties. The values may still be persisted in the sim, but you set it to none. And so that's just something that you can try. I'm just reading.
I'm going to go out on a limb here, Jeff. I might need your help on this one. Asking, do layout templates use the sim approach, or do they use something else? Now, I know we have, if you have a layout template, we have a Arcpy.mp function convert layout file to layout, and that would be one entry point where you could get to the sim.
Yeah, I mean, a layout template is just, again, the information in that layout template is persisted as JSON structure. And the only way that you would be able to get to that structure is to actually load that layout or bring that template into a project so that you can get its definition, so that you can then interrogate the elements that are inside of that layout. So again, our entry points are really quite simple. And that brings up another common question that no one has asked today, but if you go into the project background settings where you can set up a lot of common things like application settings, like anti-aliasing and last tool remembered, et cetera, some of those things that are back there, we don't expose those capabilities. We are just really limiting you currently to the basic objects, right? That's a map, it's a layer, it's a layout. And we're at least exposing those additional properties for you to make modifications to those. But there are plenty of things that you still don't have access to. So I'm going to reply back to Zach, who asked the question about API versus the sim. And he's asking again, what exactly is the managed API? Since we got the sim object through Arcpy.mp. It's really a nuance, right? So yes, through our managed API, we've exposed to you a backdoor to the JSON files that control how things are persisted in the application. So we've given you a trick through this these two managed API functions, get definition and set definition, to kind of get the keys to the kingdom, right? And expose yourself through these little portals, right, to a much larger collection of properties that aren't in the managed API. Now, some of them are, right? There are lots of things that are in these X files that we do expose through the managed API, like layer.name, right? We've exposed very common properties, things that we assume that you're going to want to automate using Arcpy.mp. But again, just in case there's something that we didn't expose through get definition and set definition, where we're giving you a secret way to get to these extra properties. Now, when I say secret, I'm being a little cute, I guess, because this is a pattern that Esri supports. And this pattern has existed in the .NET SDK since 1.1, right? And we just exposed it later on to the Python community, and we're super excited about that.
Another question regarding zoom to layer. I think this is probably not related to the sim, but somebody's asking, can you zoom to layer on a map view? And the answer is yes. And if you look at the map view class, you'll see you could get the camera and you could change the extent through the camera, or you could get a layers extent and pan to that extent. And we have, if you check out the map view class help topic, there are samples that are similar to that.
Yeah, and John McDowell asks, and hi John, I know John. He asks, do all maps in a project have its own sim? And the answer is yes. A project, a .aprx, is actually a specialized zip file. And it is a container of all of those common objects inside of a project. So each map has its own XML file that gets packaged up inside of that APRX. And that's also true of layouts and other project items that are inside of a project. So again, the only way you get to them is because we will never ask you, never, ever, ever ask you to unzip an APRX and start playing with those XML files. Boy, that's dangerous. So we're exposing that contents to you through our managed API by using the managed API to reference a map or reference a layout, and then getting its definition, making the appropriate changes, and then pushing that back to the appropriate object. And someone asked again, we've answered this a number of times. I don't know if you can find it on, but can you paste here the link to the ArcGIS online examples? Again, it's https://Esri, ESRI, URL.com/8899.
Then we got another one here. Since your entry points are map, layer, etc., is it possible to loop through a number of APRX files and apply the same changes to each? And yes, you could loop through APRX files. And say if you're changing a layer property through the sim, you could find, while you're looping through the projects, loop through the maps, find the layers that you're interested in, get the sim, and make the appropriate updates, and then save the project, and then move on to the next project in your loop.
Yeah, and I realized we went past the time. It's 3:02, so I'm gonna answer one more question, and I think we're gonna have to finish. But the question is, are sims only usable in layouts, or can you use them anywhere where you can use .mp functionality, such as reports? Great question. Again, it's not just layouts. We can work with layout objects, we can work with map objects, and layer objects. We cannot get a definition or set a definition on a report object. Now that would probably be a really good thing that we could expose in the future, but it's not available now, right, Jeff? We never exposed that.
That's right.
Yeah, but it's a great request. So with that, I just want to thank you for attending our session, and we're gonna stop now because I'm not sure if the video will just automatically stop. But thanks for coming today, and please again fill out a survey and let us know how we did.